very dangerous and very difficult to unravel.
Should the authorities, Peter, in Europe take heart from the fact that far-right groups across the continent claim to have loads in common but are very bad at coordinating?
To some extent, but it's typical when a new movement emerges, and what Elizabeth had described is essentially a new movement. It's a coalition of a lot of existing movements, that the situation is still very fluid. There are no clear hierarchies, there are no clear structures, but that emerges over time. So we are at the beginning of the emergence of something which may solidify over time. So I don't think we should take heart of that. It's quite typical of when something like this starts.
And in America, is it solidifying?
It is, to some extent, it is coalescing around certain ideas like the QAnon ideas. And of course, Trump has himself done a lot to solidify that. He is the ideological and personal kit that keeps the whole thing together. And with him, the idea that the election was stolen and that the whole system is illegitimate. That's why it would be so important for mainstream Republican politicians to come out, to respect and be honest to their voters and tell them, no, it wasn't stolen. Joe Biden is your president now.
How big is the US threat? Are we talking Civil War scale?
I don't think we are at that point yet, even though, of course, civil wars have come out of relatively small groups. I still don't think that the majority of Republicans still actually want a civil war. What I kind of foresee for the next years is a potentially very dangerous, violent terrorist threat, substantial numbers of people, but not necessarily a breakdown of the entire system.
Let's get another US perspective. Christian Picciolini was recruited into a neo-Nazi group in his hometown of Chicago. In 1987, he was only nearly 14 years old. He took part in violent attacks, he enlisted new members, and he became eventually a leader. He also wrote and recorded racist music, opening a record shop to sell the music promoting white supremacy. But it was in that store that he'd meet people who would challenge his beliefs, leading him to abandon the movement in 1995. Since then, he's used his perspective to dismantle the very groups he was once part of. When Weekend's Albana Kasapi spoke to him on the line from Chicago, she asked him first about his involvement in a recent case, that of Dylan Roof, the white supremacist responsible for the 2015 massacre of 9 black church members in South Carolina. How did that come about?
In fact, it was at the urging of somebody who was counseling him that I write him a letter. So I did. And I wanted to understand what drove a young man to do something so horrific. And it was around that same time that I was shown a post that Dylan Roof had made in a white supremacist chat room just 7 months before he had committed the act of murder. He had seen a documentary about skinheads, of which I was one 30 years ago. And he was commenting on music that he had heard in that documentary, and he posted the lyrics. And a journalist was interviewing me, and it showed me this post. And as I read these lyrics, something came over me and I had to read them again because they seemed very, very familiar. And after I read them the second time, I recognized that the lyrics that Dylan Roof had posted were actually lyrics that I had written almost 30 years ago with my band. And I recognized also that I was partly responsible potentially for having inspired him that night. It was a moment that I still have never forgot that made me just even more concerned about what was happening and more committed to trying to understand what was radicalizing young people on the internet.
And did you get any insight what had happened? Did you ever get a response from him?
He wrote me one letter that I won't really repeat, but it started off with, "You are a traitor." But what I started to understand was that he was influenced by fake news and propaganda that he was reading on white supremacist websites. And what those websites were doing were publishing misinformation, crime statistics that were very completely manipulated, that were showing that Black people were committing crimes against white people at unprecedented numbers. And these were being put out by propagandists in the white supremacist movement and targeting young people. And what I found, regardless of whether they're younger or old, is that they're searching for a sense of identity, community, and purpose. But what people encounter on that path are potholes, trauma, abuse, loss, mental health, poverty. Even privilege can be a pothole if it keeps us too separate from humanity. And those potholes detour us to the fringes where toxic narratives are very loud. And what I'm seeing now with all the uncertainty in the world is that people are starting to gravitate to these very loud hate narratives that are promising to fill those voids.
How much of a threat far-right extremism poses for America now? We're talking after the events at the Capitol.
What we saw at the Capitol was very complex. The people there were not just a singular monolithic group. There were militia members there. There were white supremacists there. There were generic Trump followers there who, had been fed these conspiracy theories. There were QAnon there. The one thing that was consistent within all those groups was the propaganda that drove them there, and also the voice from the very, very top, who then focused their energies into what ended up happening at the Capitol.
What is the best way to confront far-right extremism in America now?
Institutional and systemic racism is something that we've progressed down the road, but we still have not rid ourselves of. That is sort of a bigot spigot. We have to cut the flow from that by reforming our systems to make it equitable. But what I think is very important to understand that there are two things that extremists love, and that is silence and violence. If we're silent, if we don't do anything, if we don't hold them accountable for what very clearly is acts of fascism and racism and xenophobia and misogyny, they'll continue to do that. If we're violent towards them, they use that because they play the victim narrative. It's why they march in places that are progressive, in places like Charlottesville. They go to those places intentionally to draw attention because they know that they are creating anger. And if they're attacked unprovoked, then they see that as an opportunity to play the victim. So what we must do is we must cut the head off the snake. And I say that metaphorically. We have to make sure that the propagandists, that the leaders, the money influencers that are funding these groups, that they are cut off. And what we may see is the body of the snake be violent after we cut the head off. That means that the snake is dying. We must move in that direction because the momentum is now that fascism once again has reared its head up.
Christian Picciolini, founder of the Free Radicals Project, a global extremism prevention network. It says it's helped over 300 people. How important, Maria, do you think voices like Christian's are?
Oh, I thought that was a tremendous interview. As someone who's known it from the inside, is always vital. And I was very struck by how humane and thoughtful he was in what he was saying. I think he's absolutely right. The head has to be cut off. And then the people who were maybe drawn towards this kind of activity, who can be weaned away from it, must be supported to be weaned away.
It's easy to take his story, Peter, as one of maturing, but far-right extremism isn't just a young person's thing.
It isn't. And in fact, it's actually very interesting because those of us who study radicalization always assume that this was indeed a young people's problem, that young people have, are more prone to risk taking. That there's also what sociologists call a demographic availability. That means people haven't really got so much commitments in terms of family, in terms of professionalism. But what we see in this movement now are people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, even people in their 60s coming out. This is very different from jihadist movements, other extremist movements that consist mostly of young people.
Thank you. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley with Weekend. Let's go to Germany now, where the end of an era, the era of Chancellor Angela Merkel, has moved ever closer. Her party, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, has governed Germany for 50 out of the past 70 years, and Merkel has been in charge for 18 of those years. Now, the party has a new leader. His name is Armin Laschet. He's also a good chance to succeed Merkel as Chancellor in the next general elections due in the autumn in Germany. Joining me on the line from Berlin, Peter Altmaier, who is Germany's Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, also a close ally of Angela Merkel. So you must be pleased, Mr. Altmaier, because this is the continuity candidate who's won.
Yes, it is. It is continuity, and it is more than that. CDU is Germany's biggest and largest political party. We are integrating most political landscapes, except left-wing and right-wing extremism. But we are open for liberal, for conservative, for Christian democratic voters. And yesterday's decision was a decision in favor of moderate policy, was a favor of European and international commitment. It was a decision in favor of social market economy. That was very important, and it is a first step in the transition to the next generation of policymakers in Germany.
Is it okay to ask about her successor's sex, his gender? Because it's not crass, is it, to say that Merkel, although a leader of amazing longevity, stood out in a crowd of world leaders because she was female. Now, you only considered white middle-aged men as successors. Will that hinder the Germany standing out process?
Well, what I think is one of the remarkable results of Angela Merkel's era is that the gender policy, that equality of treatment, that equal rights have been promoted, and that considerable progress was achieved. We had not only a female chancellor for almost 16 years, but half of the ministers from my party are women. We have enormous progress with regard to the prime ministers in the German states, in the Länder, and the fact that you cannot adopt the legislation on permanent continuity with regard to chancellorship. I mean, that's a democratic fact, and I think it's not surprising that after such a long period, competition is open. But I'm pretty much sure that in the foreseeable future, women will play an important role in all areas of German politics.
Was Angela Merkel's political life saved by the COVID crisis? She was seen as tremendously reassuring for the German public at a time when she was actually in some political trouble.
Well, let me put it like this. The 16 years of, nowadays 15 years of Angela Merkel's chancellorship can be characterized as a very intensive follow-up of political challenges. You think of the Euro crisis, of the world economic crisis in 2008, 2009, and many other challenges, Ukraine crisis, and this is at the end of her last term in office, again, such an enormous challenge. And what we can see is the trust of the overwhelming majority of the people. Angela Merkel, at the end of her term, is appreciated by almost 70% of German voters.
It's an amazing figure, isn't it? We shouldn't do that down.
It is unprecedented, yes, indeed.
What will Germany miss about Angela Merkel now, do you think?
Well, I think that it is, how to put it, it's a learning process. I mean, she has been there during almost all our political lives. She enjoyed enormous reputation and credibility on international scene, and this will help successors on the one hand to make sure that continuity is guaranteed. At the same time, we will have to earn this reputation back. That's not an easy task at all. and therefore I'm relieved to see that one of the most experienced prime ministers of the biggest German state, North Rhine-Westphalia, has now been elected as a chairman of the political party.
Thank you, Peter Altmaier, Germany's Minister for Economic Affairs.
This is the BBC World Service, meeting the people behind the internet's original viral videos.
My goodness, it's the video that so many people have been talking about.
What's it like to go viral? Millions or even hundreds of millions of people watching and sharing you online. I'm Colm Flynn, meeting some of the internet's biggest and first viral video stars.
My Viral Video and Me. Today at 14 GMT. And in an hour, from our own correspondent with Pascal Harter.
The life or death dilemmas exposed by an air disaster. The lasting stigma of Ireland's mother and baby homes. And how Somalia is changing.
That's in an hour. Now it's back to weekend. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, 8 to the world news. Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Joe Biden intends to sign up to a dozen executive orders on his first day as US president, immediately reversing some of Donald Trump's most contentious policies. The measures, due to be taken within hours of his inauguration on Wednesday, include lifting a ban on travel from a group of mainly Muslim countries and rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. Mr. Biden will also call for masks to be worn on federal property to cut COVID-19 infections and more financial support for those struggling during the pandemic.
Next week, we'll take action to extend nationwide restrictions on evictions and foreclosures. This will provide more than 25 million Americans greater stability instead of living on the edge every single month. And I'm asking Congress to do its part by funding rental assistance for 14 million hard-hit families and tenants.
Thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed in Washington ahead of Wednesday's inauguration ceremony. Metal fences topped by razor wire have been put up outside Congress in response to the storming of the building by Donald Trump's supporters. Security has also been stepped up at Capitol buildings across the United States. A former senior official at the Department for Homeland Security, Elizabeth Newman, told the BBC the threat posed by far-right extremists was intense.
Outside of this whole political and white power movement dynamic, when the pandemic starts to wane and we start to reconvene and start to have mass gatherings again, I'm very, very concerned that we will see a spate of attacks. We're in a very precarious moment in this country.
Police in the Afghan capital Kabul say gunmen have shot dead 2 judges, both of them women, as a wave of assassinations continues. From Kabul, the BBC's Yogita Lamai reports.
The judges were shot at while they were on their way to work in a car. The driver has been injured. It's not known yet who was behind the attack, but it's the latest in a series of targeted killings over the past few months of journalists, activists, and women in high-profile jobs. The attacks have gone largely unclaimed, but the Afghan government has blamed the Taliban for many of them. The two sides are currently holding peace talks in Doha. But with violence surging in Afghanistan, there are serious questions over if and when an agreement can be reached.
The Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is due back in Moscow today for the first time since he was poisoned last year. Doctors treating him in Germany have said he was poisoned with a Novichok nerve agent. Mr. Navalny says the Kremlin was behind the attempt on his life, which it's always denied. He faces fraud charges in Russia and has been put on a wanted list. The BBC's Moscow correspondent says Mr. Navalny's return is a direct challenge to President Vladimir Putin. Live from London, you're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Guatemala says it sent almost 1,000 migrants back to Honduras as the authorities try to block a caravan from reaching the Mexican border. Fleeing poverty at home, up to 9,000 began their long walk to the United States this week. Will Leonardo reports.
After making their way past Guatemalan border guards, a large group of migrants came across ranks of soldiers wearing helmets and wielding sticks. Video shows many scuffling with the security forces. The authorities now say they've sent hundreds of migrants back to Honduras and have set up checkpoints along highways leading to the caravan's next destination, Mexico. The migrants may have an even tougher time there, however. Mexican soldiers are holding drills near the border in a show of force. The Foreign Ministry has joined Guatemala in strongly urging Honduras to stop the flow of migrants north, especially during the pandemic.
The Brazilian health regulator has rejected a request for emergency approval of the Russian coronavirus vaccine Sputnik V. The Anvisa agency said it made the decision because the final phase of tests wasn't carried out in Brazil. A local laboratory was planning to produce 10 million doses of the vaccine in the next 3 months. Japan's government spokesman has insisted the country is preparing to hold the delayed Tokyo Olympics as planned after a fellow cabinet minister suggested the Games might not go ahead. Katsunobu Kato brushed off media reports, citing increasingly downbeat assessments because of a resurgence of the coronavirus. He said the location and schedule for the events had all been decided. The Games are due to begin in July. The US yacht competing in the preliminary round of the America's Cup in New Zealand has suffered a dramatic capsize. The boat, called American Magic, reared into the air as it raced into a high-speed turn. The crew, who ended up in the water, are said to be safe. The Coast Guard and other competitors helped to rescue them. That's the latest BBC News. Hello, it's 8:06 GMT. This is Weekend from the BBC World Service. My name's Paul Henley, and the names of my guests today are Maria Margaronis, a writer and broadcaster here in London, and Peter Neumann, Professor of Security Studies at King's College London. More from them very soon. Now, 10 days after rioters breached the US Capitol in a deadly attack watched by the whole world, cities nationwide in America have been preparing for a potential new wave of violent protests this weekend, erecting barriers and deploying thousands of National Guard troops. Suzanne Lynch is the Irish Times' correspondent in Washington. She told me about the situation there first.
Washington is very much a fortified city, if you like, at the moment. Over the last few days, we've seen a huge build-up of military presence here, and thousands of National Guard troops have been essentially pouring into the city. That's ahead of Wednesday's inauguration and on the back of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, that deadly attack that left 5 people dead. So there's been a real emphasis on making sure that security is in place ahead of Wednesday's events.
And are the authorities still expecting trouble elsewhere as well, in other states?
Yeah, so the FBI last week issued a warning to officials in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. that there were some extremist movements planning some kind of actions at state capitals across the country, now to different extents and to different levels. So we're seeing the kind of closures and fortifications we're seeing in Washington, D.C. You're also seeing those around the country. So, for example, in the capital of Michigan, Lansing, that's now got fencing, etc. Similarly in Austin, Texas. So I think a lot of officials around the country are on alert. I mean, one of the issues now, however, is that now that a lot of social media platforms have clamped down on extremist groups and extremist supporters, it may in fact be more difficult to track activity. It's not as much in plain sight. So there's very much a sense of anxiety here in the air, even though we're hearing nothing this weekend so far of any imminent attack that investigators have discovered ahead of Wednesday.
Social media often gives signs of tension. What are the indications there?
It's more on right-wing extremist platforms where a lot of the activity seems to be. Also, a lot of the more fringe groups, they're using, the Twitter-like platform Gab, for example. That's popular with far-right groups. We're also seeing a lot more use of encrypted messaging services. Again, it's more difficult to monitor, if you like, in some ways. But we're seeing kind of a mix on these platforms. So we're seeing in some organizations or some activists, right-wing activists, are discouraging their people from coming out to DC, saying that it's a trap, saying that their groups may have already been infiltrated by left-wing activists. But then other indications that people are still being encouraged to arrive to DC. But as you said there, it is so heavily fortified now, not just around the capital, but for miles.
And one arrest to mention at one of those checkpoints, which could be a sign of more to come.
Yeah, that was a worrying development. A man from Virginia was arrested by police. He was found with a gun and rounds of ammunition in his truck. And he was carrying, police said, not government authorised identification. He'd stopped at a security checkpoint near the Capitol. Now, that man has been arrested, as I say. He has been charged, but he is saying that he was actually a private security worker and that he had come from Virginia, a state where there are more liberal, if you like, gun laws, and that he had made an honest mistake. So we're still waiting to hear details on that.
That was Suzanne Lynch, who's a Washington correspondent for the Irish Times. Now, Joe Biden intends to sign up to a dozen executive orders on his first day as president, immediately reversing some of Donald Trump's more contentious policies. Those measures include lifting a ban on travel from a group of mainly Muslim countries and rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. And as Mr. Biden prepares to take office as 46th president of the US, he has the unenviable task ahead of attempting to heal a country riven by political differences. In his presidential victory speech, he underlined the priority of bringing Americans together, but it's clear now that not all Americans are willing to make amends. Arguably, with the rise of extremism, American democracy itself is under threat. I've been speaking to the influential US political scientist, Dr. Francis Fukuyama, who famously argued in 1989 in his book The End of History that Western liberal democracy would be mankind's final form of government. He told me his trust on Western democracy remained unshaken even after this month's riots in Washington.
The United States has been an inspiration to countries, but right now it's not because of its own internal problems. I actually don't think that the vast majority of Americans have given up on democracy. You know, the problem with many Trump supporters is not that they've suddenly turned authoritarian, but they've been persuaded by their president to believe that the recent election was stolen, and they think they're the ones that are protecting the Constitution and the integrity of the democratic process. But I think that at the moment, the United States is not going to be exporting its system anywhere. I think until we fix this problem, I don't think we really have a right to say much to other countries.
We hear a lot about Joe Biden intending to mend bridges and to bring the American people back together. That's hardly going to happen immediately, with impeachment being the first thing that he oversees.
I actually support impeachment because I think that there are certain actions which, if not formally condemned through a legal process, will set precedents for the future. So I don't think that process will deepen the division. And I think there's some reason for optimism because although the majority of Republicans continue to support Trump, a number of them began to break and tell their own people the truth about what had happened in the election. Furthermore, they have to worry about power in the long run.
You seem quite calm in the face of the collapse of much of what you hold dear in the political world.
Well, yes, but I'm screaming on the inside. I think that, the experience of watching the assault on the Congress and realizing that there are many Americans on the right that are willing to turn to violence is very scary.
President Biden does indeed have problems reasserting democratic leadership on the domestic stage. He might have bigger problems on the world stage, mightn't he?
Well, it's yes and no. I think that because presidents have much more authority over foreign policy, he will be able to make decisions that will be consequential, like rejoining the World Health Organization or the Paris Climate Accords, reaffirming American support for NATO and the like. The harder task he's going to have is to persuade both friends and enemies that the United States is going to be either a reliable partner or a determined opponent, because I think everybody sees the internal divisions in the United States and figures that whatever Biden decides may not last.
So do you think that America is a permanently damaged brand, given the expansion, for instance, of Chinese interests in the world?
I don't think anything is permanent. I think that there are weaknesses that we are not seeing in the Chinese system that will play out over time. The argument in favor of democratic systems is that they are self-correcting. And I would say that despite everything that happened on January 6th, American institutions largely held. The checks and balances in our system that prevent a real abuse of power of the sort that Trump was attempting, were thwarted. And that's something that can't happen in a country like China. If the leader goes on on an authoritarian binge, there's nothing people can do about it. So I do think that there are still powerful reasons why democracies, constitutional rule of law democracies, will do better in the long run.
Dr. Francis Fukuyama, Senior Fellow at Stanford and Director of the Center on Democracy, Development and Rule of Law. Maria, you were in Washington 4 years ago. This is going to be a very different presidential inauguration, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's going to seem like a militarized zone. But it also, I think, will be a moment of great relief, assuming it's pulled off. It goes off smoothly. And I obviously feel Joe Biden obviously has a huge task ahead of him. One of the most hopeful signs for me is that he has elevated science to a place that it really needs at the moment by making the Office of Science and Technology Policy a cabinet-level position and creating an office in the West Wing dedicated to addressing climate change. The return to reality and fact is absolutely essential.
Mr. Biden is reported to say that he feels safe with this inauguration coming up. Is he right to feel so, Peter Neumann? I suppose he would never dare to say otherwise.
Well, I think things rarely happen in exactly the same way twice. So there's a lot of military, a lot of police, a lot of protection now in Washington, D.C., preventing exactly that scenario. And of course, also deterring people from coming to D.C. in the first place. So I don't think there will be another storm on the Capitol, but there will be violence along the path. So even if nothing happens in the next 2 or 3 days or nothing major, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no threat.
Normally, this is an occasion for supporters of a new president to line the streets and cheer him on. I suppose America, the whole world, is used to the absence of crowds now, though, Maria.
Yes, although we saw a very big crowd on January 6th without masks, obviously, all storming the Capitol.
True.
Yes, obviously there won't be the usual crowds at the inauguration.
Thank you. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. Maria Margaronis and Peter Neumann are my guests. We're going to talk about Russia now, and the leading Russian opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, is due to fly back to his home country today. His return comes just months after he was poisoned with a Novichok nerve agent and flown to Germany for life-saving treatment. Mr. Navalny says Russian intelligence agents carried out the attack. The Kremlin has denied any role in this poisoning and rejected Mr. Navalny's claims that President Vladimir Putin himself ordered it. However, in December, Mr. Navalny apparently duped a Russian FSB agent into revealing details of the attack made on him. He impersonated a security official to call the agent, Konstantin Kuryatsev, and asked him where in Mr. Navalny's clothes the poison had been placed.
Okay, then tell me what kind of clothes it was applied on. What was the main focus? What's the riskiest piece of clothing, in theory?
Well, underpants.
Underpants.
The BBC's Sergei Goryashko joins us now live from Moscow. Apologies for the quality of the line. I hear it's not good, but Sergei, welcome. It must be very risky, surely, for Alexei Navalny to return to Russia.
Hello, Gav. Thank you for having me. Of course, it's risky, and he is in a risky situation now because he's facing criminal charges on another cases, and he could be arrested at the airport. Nevertheless, Navalny decided that he will keep his promise to return to Russia, and he's expected today to show up at Vnukovo Airport in Moscow.
Is there any doubt that he'll be a target once again, or is that an attack on him, another attack, just too obvious for the authorities to try?
Well, from one hand, if Russian authorities usually try to kill a person if they want him to be dead, and they usually achieve these goals. But in case of Navalny, that will be a tricky one because he's just been in Europe, but European leaders consider him as a politician who's threatened by Vladimir Putin, and they're not happy with that. And in these cases, Russia face really severe sanctions if they try to kill Navalny or to put him in prison, which is why probably Alexei Navalny is feeling himself safe to return to Russia.
Just your opinion, Sergei, briefly and finally, how big an opposition figure would Mr. Navalny be if he hadn't been stopped, arrested, imprisoned, had publicity taken away from him inside Russia up till now?
Well, I think that he will be even a bigger opposition figure now, and it's not, and it's not a question whether he will be arrested today or will not be arrested and will remain free, because he's already it's a big story with his poisoning and the investigation which came up later. So of course he lost his health. He lost like a couple of months of his life, and that's a very scary thing to happen. But he definitely won some publicity, and he definitely even more popularity among Russians.
Thank you very much. That was the BBC's Sergei Goryashko on the line from Moscow. Apologies for the quality of that line. We hope you made out most of what Sergei had to say. This is the BBC World Service. Now, here's a slightly unlikely sound to have been a massive social media hit recently.
Soon may the weatherman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. She had not been 2 weeks from shore when down on her.
That was Nathan Evans and friends. He's a postman from Airdrie in Scotland with a wailing song that he recorded and put on the social media site TikTok. It's now been viewed over 4 million times. Nathan uploads sea shanties, or traditional sailors' songs, both as solos and accompanied by up to 100 people. In fact, he's become a bit of a craze, and some are calling the whole thing the sea shanty talk. What is it about sea shanties that are making them so popular online, especially during the pandemic? Catherine Tackley is head of music at the University of Liverpool, and she has a specialist interest in sea shanties of the 21st century. She joins me now. Let's start with what exactly qualifies as a sea shanty, Catherine. Welcome, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, most simply, a sea shanty is a nautical work song. So these weren't songs that were originally really designed primarily for entertainment for an audience. They were designed to accompany the very hard labour that went on board ship. So pulling ropes or winding capstans, it needed to be well coordinated. And the other thing is that, of course, your morale needed to be kept up when you were doing this, often in very sort of tough conditions. So that was really the purpose of a sea shanty. And of course, there are a lot of other types of songs that are connected with the sea as well. And, the real purists about this would definitely.
Odie, I think we've lost the line. There's a lot of that. We'll come back to you. Let's see if we can just improve the line. Catherine Tackley from the University of Liverpool. I want to get a take on sea shanties from our guest. We will come back to you. Maria Margaronis, I don't know if you're familiar with the sea shanty, particularly the modern one. What do you make of it?
Oh, I love this. I think this is absolutely great. I've actually done this, pulled on a rope to hoist the sails on a replica of a 19th century schooner, and the rhythm of the song is vital. And I think this is a moment where so many people want to escape, which for me is always about going to sea and getting into the wide open spaces.
There's a particularly British form of nostalgia, isn't there? Perhaps imagining a past that never quite existed. Is it true that all Brits fancy themselves as survivors of the Blitz or salty men and women of the sea?
I don't know. I mean, for me, this is more to do with my Greek ancestry and the fact that all my ancestors were seafarers. So I feel it's like, yes, Britain has this, Britannia rules the waves thing, but the sea was very, very important in the past. It was, before we had airplanes, it was how we got from one place to another.
Catherine Tackley, is there a particular musical form of the sea shanty?
I think the most important thing musically is there's this sense of call and response backwards and forwards between a shantyman and the crew. So that might be line by line, or it could be, in fact, a kind of verse and chorus, which is the case in the Wellerman. So there's always something which everyone can join in with, and that's really important. But as we all know, a catchy melody is essential as well.
Tell me about yearning or wistful lyrics, perhaps a longing for home in sea shanties, or in the case of us being at the height of the pandemic, maybe a yearning to return to some kind of normality.
I think that's right. These were about work and these were about the business of work, but also there's a lot of reflective content about what it was like, life in port, what they had to look forward to after these long voyages. And I think, the fact that we can all join in with these shanties so easily, it sort of brings that quality through now when we're sort of using them in 21st century life. Most obviously up to this point, they've been connected to the maritime, but I think this latest part of it and TikTok has proved that actually anyone can join in. And that's a really important part of the shanty, going right back to its earliest days.
Peter Neumann, in your daily perusal of TikTok, have you come across the sea shanty?
Yes, of course. To be honest, I'd never heard about this. And I was genuinely pleasantly surprised, of course, also because the guys who are singing it are not looking like the kind of guys you're expecting to sing music like this.
What do they look like? What do you mean?
Well, they're built up. They are looking. A lot of them are looking like bodybuilders, and so it's quite a surprise and a pleasant one. I love it.
Well, chunky fishermen in chunky sweaters is kind of what you imagine, isn't it, Catherine?
Oh, well, yeah, I think that's most people's idea. What's been so interesting for me looking at this TikTok is that also we got participation from women and all sorts of different people that you might not necessarily associate in that way. And what that adds sort of musically is this real sort of resonance, with that clip that you played, you can hear that resonance, people singing in different octaves and fourths and fifths. And it makes such a really satisfying musical sound. I think that's one of the reasons probably why this has been so popular for us just now.
And it's not a sexist thing, the sea shanty, is it? It's not women who sing of yearning for sailors to come home. Women can actually do the main singing themselves of the sea shanty, can they?
Absolutely. I think, back in the days, definitely some of the lyrics were pretty bawdy and definitely sexist. But what we've seen more recently is a sort of repurposing of the shanty. And there were work songs, similar kind of work songs for women doing the jobs allied to the fishing industry online, so shucking oysters and mending nets and that kind of thing. But now actually there are a large number of all-female shanty groups that have really repurposed this form in the modern day as well.
Catherine Tackley from the University of Liverpool on sea shanties. Thank you very much. We're going to treat you to, nearly a minute of a traditional sea shanty now, sung by David Coffin. It's called Roll the Old Chariot. You've been listening to Weekend on the BBC World Service. Many thanks to Peter Neumann and Maria Margaronis, who've been our guests. Join us again soon if you can. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
This is the BBC World Service. Sana Safi brings us a new series.
Education, equality, ending hunger, climate action, clean water. These are some of the 17 goals that the United Nations set in a plan to change the world by 2030. 5 years after they were announced, we are travelling to 17 countries and meeting 17 17-year-olds to find out how and if their lives are changing.
We have a responsibility to help our people.
In the first episode, we meet Lanway in Leeds, looking at goal number 1. eradicating poverty.
Right now, there are too many people struggling who are living below the poverty line in the UK.
How is this issue affecting his community?
I had a child, we rang up to see why they weren't in school, and he said because it's his sister's turn to wear the shoes today.
We have all these ideas and we want to do all these amazing things, but without the funding, then it's not going to get anywhere.
Project 17, Wednesday at 13:30 and 23:30 GMT.
Hello, I'm Marnie Chesterton, and on this week's Science, we're in Greece at a 240-kilometre ultra-marathon. We witness the pain, the joy and the steely determination of people who run this far.
I'm still moving forward. It's not pretty, it's not fast, but it is movement. Kick me in the butt and tell me to keep going.
Keep going! But what are the limits of human endurance? That's the question on this week's Crowd Science, coming up next.
BBC News with David Harper. Joe Biden's team has revealed details of up to a dozen executive orders which the US president-elect will sign within hours of his inauguration. The measures will reverse key parts of Donald Trump's programme. They include joining the Paris Climate Accord and scrapping a ban on travel from a number of largely Muslim countries. Thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed in Washington ahead of the ceremony on Wednesday. Police in the Afghan capital Kabul say gunmen have shot dead 2 judges, both of them women, as a wave of assassinations continues. They were killed as they were driven to work. Guatemala says it sent almost 1,000 migrants back to Honduras as it tries to stop them reaching the Mexican border. They're among about 9,000 who are hoping to reach the United States. The Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is due back in Moscow later for the first time since he was nearly killed last year by a nerve agent attack. He says the Kremlin was behind the attempt on his life, an allegation the Russian government has denied. Mr. Navalny faces arrest on his return. NASA has denied that a test of the huge engines, which are a central part of its plans to send astronauts back to the moon, amounted to a failure. The first simultaneous firing of all 4 engines used in the Artemis program was halted after little more than a minute. Japan's government spokesman says preparations to hold the delayed Tokyo Olympics are going ahead, despite the suggestion by a cabinet minister the Games might not happen. According to opinion polls, most people in Japan want the Olympics to be put off or cancelled. A tennis coach has apologised after he contracted COVID-19, forcing 23 players he'd travelled with on a flight to quarantine 3 weeks before the Australian Open. Sylvain Buno said he had no idea how he caught the virus. He tested negative within 72 hours of boarding the flight. That's the latest BBC News.
The racing's the easy bit, the hard bit's the months of getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning training.
This is just such an amazing spectacle and an event. It's a great honour to be able to run in the footsteps of Adipodes.
Oh, I've been dreaming of this many years, so this is a dream come true. Now I just want to start running.
Hello and welcome to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. I'm Marnie Chesterton, and right now my producer Kathy and I are on top of a hill in Athens in the shadow of the Acropolis, world famous landmark. It's just breaking dawn. And we have just watched 400 hardcore runners take off for the start of a 246-kilometre race. They're going to help us answer this week's question, which comes from 2 similarly energetic Crowd Science listeners.
Hello, Crowd Science. I am Alberto Sanz in Saitama, Japan. And my question is, what are the limits of human endurance?
I'm Aya Matsuda from Hiratsuka City, Japan, and I'd like to know what the best diet is for endurance activity.
So, 2 questions about human endurance, its limits and the best diet for fueling it. We were struck that both of these questions came from listeners in Japan, so we arranged for them to meet up and go for a run in one of Tokyo's most famous jogging spots. And then we gave them a call.
Hello.
Hello, this is Marnie.
Hi, this is Alberto.
Oh, lovely to meet you. Where are you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm now at Sakuradamon in the center of Tokyo. It's a rainy day here in Tokyo.
So we've bullied you into coming out into the dark and the rain for Crowd Science. I really appreciate that. You're wondering about the limits of human endurance.
Right, this is a very interesting question to me because I've been trying to push my limits a little bit, improving my best time for a marathon race. My current best time is about 3 hours, 35 minutes. I'm very interested in trying to identify if there is any way I could push the limit a little bit, not just with training, but maybe with mindset, diet.
Alberto, we'll definitely look into that for you. With diet in mind, can you pass me to Aya?
Definitely, I pass it on. Thank you.
Hello, Marnie.
Hello, Aya. You are also a pretty serious athlete. You do long-distance triathlons. What's that involve?
Usually it's 3.8 kilometers of swimming, and then you get on a bike and ride for maybe 160 to 190 kilometers. And then finally you go to the running part, which is the full marathon, which is 42.1 kilometers.
That's a very long way. Having done it once, what was it that made you want to do that again?
Because it's fun. And the feeling that you get when you reach the goal, it makes you want to do more, harder and better.
And you've asked us about the best diet to help improve your time. What kind of diet have you got in mind?
My digestive systems get really tired when I'm using my muscles. So my theory is if I could reduce my food intake as minimum as possible, it might improve the fatigue in my digestive system.
Well, we are definitely going to try and find some answers for you too, Aya. And I will leave you guys to your running.
Thank you.
From rainy Tokyo to an unusually rainy Greece, where we've come to follow an ultra-marathon in the search for the limits of extreme endurance. A marathon is 26.2 miles. This ultra-marathon is about 6 of those, run back to back. It's normally done in southern European sunshine, but this time a freak hurricane has turned up with the runners, so in the wind and the rain, it's going to be even more demanding. One of those taking part is the Greek-American runner Dean Karnassus.
When you leave Athens, it's chaotic because there's a lot of traffic. You're on city streets. You got to really keep your eyes open in the beginning. And as you progress further and further in the course, it becomes more rural. And you get some sweeping vistas of the ocean, and it's beautiful. And then you come around a corner and there's an oil refinery. You have hills, you have a mountain you have to climb. You have a lot of adversity along the way.
What does it feel like to run so far?
It's hard to describe. There are moments where you feel very strong and you feel like you can keep running forever. And a couple instants later, you feel like, oh, I got to stop. This hurts so badly. I can't make it to the street corner. And then you push through that wall and you emerge on the other side and you feel strong again.
The popularity of ultramarathons has shot up in recent years, but the Spartathlon race has an ancient pedigree. The runners follow in the 2,500-year-old footsteps of a Greek messenger, Phidippides. He's famous for his legendary 26-mile run from the Bay of Marathon to Athens. That's where we get the word marathon from. But before that, Phidippides had already run from Athens all the way to the southern city of Sparta in a day and a half to summon the Spartan troops to help fight against Persian invaders. And it's that journey of 246 kilometres that the modern-day Spartathlon recreates. I'm on that stretch of route, Phidippides' route, with my producer Kathy. Kathy, 246 kilometres, 150 miles. That is Delhi to Jaipur. It's Kampala in Uganda to the border of Kenya. It's really long distance. I can't believe people are running that in a day and a half.
I can't believe they're on their feet for a day and a half. And the fastest people here will do it in less than 24 hours. And we are not going to try and keep up with them in any way, shape or form. But I think since we're here on that ancient route, we should do a little bit of token running.
This is why you said bring your trainers.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, let's go.
I don't think I know how to do this, but I presume you just put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
My name's Dr. Mark Burnley. I'm an endurance physiologist working from the University of Kent. I investigate the physiology that underpins how fast somebody can run 800 metres, 10,000 metres, a marathon, an ultra-marathon, and what's going on whilst you're doing those things.
Right, I want answers to that then, please. I mean, we're looking at the limits of human endurance and particularly long-distance running. We all know that we can't run long distances at our fastest possible sprint pace. How come our bodies don't let us do that?
What we have in the body is essentially two systems of energy delivery. So we have aerobic metabolism, which is using molecular oxygen from the atmosphere. We then have anaerobic metabolism, which are energy transfer processes not involving oxygen. Let's say you could sprint for a marathon. The marathon world record would then be 70 minutes rather than just over 120 minutes. And the reason the body can't do that is because you cannot supply that energy rapidly enough using the aerobic system. Aerobic metabolism is quite slow, whereas anaerobic metabolism is extremely fast. You know, your classic anaerobic events are the 100 meters, 200 meters, 400 meters. Anything above that, it's the aerobic system that predominates.
Is there a speed limit? What are the limiting factors?
Well, in distance running, we like to think of three parameters. The first of those is your maximal oxygen uptake, or your VO2 max, as we sometimes call it, which is, if you like, the size of your engine. And that's determined largely by the size of your heart. Then you've got the lactate threshold. And the lactate threshold is, if you like, though, how much of that engine can you utilize before there are consequences. The third parameter is your running economy. So what is your engine's fuel economy? And so you want the highest VO2 max possible, the highest lactate threshold possible, and also to be as economical as possible. If you put those three together, you'll run a fast marathon.
When it comes to marathons, human limits keep getting stretched and records keep getting broken. In 2019, under very specific conditions, the runner Eliud Kipchoge completed the distance in under 2 hours. Back in Greece, the Spartathlon runners are getting to the 26-mile mark in 3 or 4 hours, nowhere near the fastest marathon records, but then again, they've got another 5 marathons to go. There's a mat that people, as they run past, will have to run over. It clicks them in, and then they're just off. Here's another couple of runners nonchalantly passing through. If I got this far, and I'm never going to get this far because obviously it's a marathon.
Never say never.
No, I'm very happy saying never. I just, want garlands of flowers and champagne. These guys want maybe half a cup of flat Coca-Cola.
Endurance limits in terms of ultra endurance, it's very much a case of trying to limit the amount of damage that you do to your body in that particular event. When we talk about 5,000 and 10,000 meter running, we often talk about, you've got to get up to a certain pace, you've got to be able to hold that pace. In an ultra endurance run, what you're trying to do is complete the task. And I remember there was a time when I trained an ultra distance runner to run a 60-mile event, and it was quite an interesting thing because he was a former sprinter. And he ran like a gazelle. He was absolutely beautiful, rangy running style. And I said immediately, you need to shuffle. Because if you run 60 miles like that, you're going to break down at 30. So he actually learned how to run like an ultra distance runner, which is trying to run with minimal leg lift, essentially trying to minimize the energy cost of your running.
Yay, go team!
How are you?
We're rooting for Dean as he reaches the marathon mark looking strong, although he's had a less than perfect start to the race.
I got hit by a car. I got hit. Really? Yes. It's not good. But anyway, how's everyone?
Hey, you've just run a marathon and been hit by a car. How are you?
Been running a marathon, been hit by a car.
Basically how you're feeling.
Like I just ran a marathon. It's
Yeah.
okay. I was kind of being a little conservative just to keep my energy.
You haven't broken a sweat?
Not yet. Yeah. We got a long way to go. This is, I know this is just a start.
Dean, are you hungry?
Not so much yet.
Do you have to force yourself to eat, or do you get, hungry properly?
You got to remember to eat. Eating's good, and sometimes you forget to eat, and that's a bad thing. Yeah.
Feeding stations are scattered along the Spartathlon route. When you're on the move for 36 hours, you're going to need to eat. But how much and what? This brings us back to our listener Aya's question. What is the best diet for endurance exercise? She was wondering about cutting her food intake to the minimum. Is that a good idea? We phoned sports dietitian and ultramarathon runner Alex Cook for some help.
One really important thing I must say to any athlete is that it's individual. So what works for your teammates might not work for you. There is one thing we cannot escape from, though, is the fact that if you aren't meeting your body's nutritional needs, you're not going to reach your full performance potential.
Is there a clash between trying to run and using your digestive system? Does one put stress on the other?
Yeah, so it's really common for, I'd say, endurance athletes mainly to suffer stomach problems when they're racing.
Listener Aya was specifically wondering if it was a good idea to cut down to one meal a day to reduce the pressure on her digestive system.
No, absolutely not. Eating one meal a day is not going to have you anywhere near meeting your nutritional requirements that your body needs to perform at that level.
So how do you get the right balance between eating enough to fuel yourself whilst avoiding putting unnecessary stress on your digestive system?
So first of all, it's about making sure that you eat at the right times and eating the right things. The general advice is eating a main meal sort of 3 to 4 hours before we train, and then maybe having a smaller snack an hour before training. And also what you eat. Fat and protein do take longer to digest. So it's about making sure that you're not having things that are too high in fat and protein, and some good slow release carbohydrates 3 to 4 hours before you train. And eat individually. I find a lot of people read about some amazing diet somebody's done and follow it themselves and find that it doesn't work for them.
But presumably you get to that through trial and error.
Yeah, you do.
So maybe Aya should try one meal a day, find if it works for her.
I mean, I think she will find pretty quickly that it doesn't. It won't take long for her to realise that eating one meal a day is certainly not the best fueling strategy for training for an Ironman.
You're listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service, where we're probing the limits of human endurance. We've just heard how looking after your body by giving it enough fuel is essential, but the psychological side of endurance is also critical. By the time the runners get halfway through the Spartathlon, for example, they still have to run 123 kilometres, much of that through the night.
I think the first half you run with your legs, and the next half you run with your mind. There comes a point in the race where the pain is, it owns you, and you have to just reckon with the fact that you're in a lot of pain and it's not going to go away, and to deal with it. What I do is I try to be in the moment, not to think about how much further the finish line is. I just think about getting to the next tree and get to the next road sign. Put the blinders on as far as the future. Don't reflect on the past. Just be the best that you can be in the present moment of time. And that'll get you through some tremendous lows.
It's midnight, it's dark, it's raining, we're under a bridge. There's a couple of trestle tables set up and some torch lights stuck into the wall that are lighting up just under this bridge. And we're waiting here for Dean and the other exhausted runners who are coming through. That's Dean. Hello.
How are you girls?
More importantly, how are you?
Oh, I'm feeling it. Oh, that's for sure. It's real at this point. You know, your whole body starts to hurt.
Dean arrives looking exhausted. We don't want to slow him down, so we run alongside him down the dark mountain lanes. So what is it like taking each pace?
It's really demoralizing, going this slowly. I mean, the last time I did that, I was 5 hours ahead of this place.
I think you're doing a pretty good job.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. That gives me a little energy.
You said this is the bit where the psychological game is important.
Oh, very much so. I'm still moving forward. It's not pretty, it's not fast, but it is movement. Kick me in the butt and tell me to keep going.
Keep going, keep going. Thanks, you can do it. You're doing a brilliant job. We'll see you for breakfast. Yeah. Oh, man. You can hear the stillness around us. There is nothing. We're on a hillside in Greece, and Dean has just run off into the darkness, hurting. The prospect of running over a mountain in the dark and rain when you've already been going for 17 hours and still have 100 kilometres ahead of you, imagine the psychological strength that requires. Dr. Carla Mayen is a sports psychologist specialising in endurance, and I asked her if there's something special about the mindset of people who take part in these events.
There's some evidence to suggest that those who compete in ultra-endurance events have a higher pain tolerance. We don't quite know whether that pain tolerance is the result of pushing yourself and going through all these events, or whether that's something that you have at the start and therefore you pick up those kind of events.
One of the runners that we spoke to reckons that this is the kind of race you run the first half with your legs and the second half with your mind. Is there any science behind that?
It's a good question. There is some science behind the idea that maybe after 88 kilometres or so, your cognitions, your thoughts start to change. You might feel a bit disoriented, confused, those types of things. And I guess in the bigger picture is self-regulation. How are you able to deal with that?
Self-regulation is vital for running ultramarathons, but I reckon these ideas could help our listener Alberto too. He wanted to know if he could improve his marathon time by working on his mindset. In that moment in the race where his body's exhausted, are there psychological techniques he can use to push his limits?
So what's really important there is you want to reflect on previous experiences and learn from those. So that helps to identify critical events and psychologically prepare for that. So you already have a response in place. When you're so tired, if you then have to think about how you're going to deal with that particular moment, that's even going to take more energy. So it's about already preparing that response so you have an automatic response ready in that particular moment.
Presumably the big thing would be your brain going, this hurts, just stop.
Yes.
How do you overcome that one?
So it may be that at that stage, be like, okay, I'm tired. Maybe I need to take on some more nutrition. It might be that you're trying to actively distract yourself, where you might think about what you maybe reward yourself at the end of the event. It could be that you're actually using what they call active regulation strategies. So you might use motivational self-talk, things like you can do it, statements that would help. Or you could use relaxation strategies.
It reminds me of one of those choose-your-own-adventure games where things keep coming at you. I'm feeling this in my legs, I'm feeling this sense of tiredness, and you need to have all of the strategies in place to be able to battle each one away.
Exactly. You need to practice them. So when you start to talk yourself into exhaustion, how can you then get yourself back into talking yourself out of exhaustion?
Talking of exhaustion, we'd left Dean at the foot of a mountain with 100 kilometres left to run. He'd had to run through the night, battling a bruised hip and mind-bending fatigue, whilst we went back for some rest. In the morning, we went to meet him at a checkpoint and found no Dean. This is a problem. There are cut-off times along the route. If you don't get there by then, you're out of the race. And the checkpoint where we were waiting was already beginning to pack up. Hello, this is Kathy and Marnie.
Hey guys.
Dean, we're by one of the checkpoints about 3/4 of the way through the race. Whereabouts are you?
We were driving. I just couldn't sustain my pace. I didn't make a cutoff.
Oh man. We left you, you're about to climb a mountain in the dark and the rain.
It got to me. My hip, 24 hours of rain.
You made it over the mountain though?
I got over the mountain, I got down the mountain and started hitting the flats, and to be honest, I'm somewhat relieved.
Relieved?
So as many of these races that I've done, one of the things that's so appealing to me is there's never any certainty you're going to finish an ultramarathon.
Are you going to try this one again in the future?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Dean, it's been emotional. I'm kind of trying not to cry in a car, and I haven't run anywhere.
I'll tell you what, I have such respect for anyone who was part of this race. I mean, it was, yeah.
Being hit by a car and running 200 kilometres in a hurricane is really going to test your limits. Dean is determined to try again next year, but at this point, his Spartathlon was over. Kathy and I drive on towards the finish line in Sparta, where we can see just how close other runners are to the limits of their endurance. So we've found the runners. Running might be an overstatement. Some of them are making foot movements a bit like a runner, and it's chucking it down with rain. Oh, I just want to pick them up and then give them all a cup of tea and a hug. So we're in Sparta. We're by the finish line, and there's someone coming up. Arthur, we spoke to you, I think it was nearly 36 hours ago.
Oh, yeah.
Given that you've just finished, how are you feeling?
It's unbelievable emotion. One goes through so many good and bad times, and I'm so honoured. It's just an unbelievable race.
It's very similar to what you said at the start, and you don't even look tired. How are you feeling?
I'm shattered.
That's reassuring to know that you're
facade.
human. Well, congratulations.
No, thank you so much.
Well done. The mental strength that it takes to finish this race does have a price. The emotion of finishing it is quite incredible, but just off to one side, there are a bunch of people who've collapsed. They're on drips, and I'm left wondering just what has running 246 kilometres done to these runners' bodies.
Lovely to meet you. How are you? It's Dora.
Hi. Dr. Dora Papadopoulou is an orthopaedic surgeon and sports medicine consultant who's been looking after exhausted runners here for the last 10 years. What's it been like this morning?
Crazy. We never had such conditions.
She gave us a tour of the makeshift medical tents.
Next door we have blisters, musculoskeletal problems and cramps and stuff like this, which is very, very common, to be honest. We have the first British lady arrive, so you can...
Okay, can we come and tag along?
Yeah, of course, come over. So Kat had a bit low blood pressure and felt sick, but she's doing really well. She was a star.
Kat, who's one of the British runners, is covered in a blanket. She's on a stretcher and she's got a drip, 2 drips going into her. And you've finished. My heartiest congratulations.
Thank you. It feels like a bit of a dream.
Presumably not an entirely pleasant dream. Your face says you're in pain, are you?
Yeah, from about 70 miles I kept having a lot of moments where I just thought I wouldn't make it, running in the dark in a thunderstorm. I mean, obviously overall it was positive, but...
Is this the furthest you've ever run?
Yeah. So
Is this the furthest you're ever going to run?
Yes. I'm never doing this again, ever.
Earlier in the programme, we heard that running a race like this is about trying not to break down. And now we've seen some of the ways runners have broken down, both before and after the finish line. But after they've pushed themselves to the limits, recovery can be remarkable. A recent study of Spartathlon runners showed that just after the race, their blood samples looked similar to those of people close to death. Yet within days, those samples had returned to normal. In an effort to answer listener Alberto's question, we've had a sprint through the science of endurance. It feels like research into human limits is at early stages, but what we do know is that to run extreme distances safely, there's no question you have to be healthy and well-trained. Part of that is knowing when, in the quest to push the limits of human endurance, you shouldn't ignore those messages from your body telling you, seriously, it's time to stop. Well done to Arthur, Kat, Dean and all the runners we met along the way. Next week on Crowd Science, I'll be asking if there are any downsides to cleaning too much. But for now, I'll hand back to our very own Crowd Science athletes to end the show.
We've reached the finish line of this edition of Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. This week's questions were from me, Alberto Sanz.
And from me, Aya Matsuda. And the program was presented by Marnie Chesterton and produced by Kathy Edwards.
If you have any science questions you'd like answered, please email to crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
This is the BBC World Service, continuing our series of US presidential profiles.
This is a moment of real consequence for America.
Kamala Harris is making history.
She's a trailblazer. She's someone who has broken barriers.
Join me, Mark Coles, for an in-depth look at the prosecutor turned politician.
Presidential Profiles, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in 30 minutes, Outlook with Emily Webb.
Opataya Fawai grew up hungry for knowledge about his ancestors. The music he wrote about them turned him into an award-winning artist and caught the attention of Disney, the Polynesian family behind Moana's smash hit songs on Outlook Weekend.
Next, it's from our own correspondent here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
On From Our Own Correspondent after this bulletin, the life or death dilemmas exposed by an air disaster.
Indonesia is made up of thousands of islands, so to get around you have two choices, either long journeys by boat or you fly. But the infrastructure and implementation of aviation safety has struggled to keep up.
The lasting stigma of Ireland's mother and baby homes.
Local people would tell him, "You don't know who you are. You're dirt from the street." Potential girlfriends would be warned by their parents he could be carrying a disease.
And how Somalia is changing.
People speak less about militant assaults and more about extortion. They say Al-Shabaab has morphed into a mafia-like organisation, extracting money from businesses, government workers and many others.
All that on From Our Own Correspondent with me, Pascal Harter, after this bulletin of BBC World News.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Joe Biden intends to sign up to a dozen executive orders on his first day as US President. The measures, due to be taken within hours of his inauguration on Wednesday, include lifting a ban on travel from a group of mainly Muslim countries and rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. Mr. Biden will also call for masks to be worn on federal property to cut COVID-19 infections. Peter Bowes reports.
In the first hours and days of the Biden administration, the new president will approve a slew of executive orders eliminating with a signature some of President Trump's most controversial policies. The days leading up to the inauguration ceremony will involve some of the tightest security ever seen in Washington and around the country, with warnings from the FBI about further armed protests by supporters of President Trump. Tens of thousands of National Guard members are already patrolling the streets.
Those thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed in Washington ahead of Wednesday's inauguration ceremony. Metal fences topped by razor wire have been put up outside Congress in response to the storming of the building by Donald Trump's supporters earlier this month. Many roads have been closed. Security has also been stepped up at Capitol buildings across the United States after the FBI warned they could be targeted by protesters. Police in the Afghan capital Kabul say gunmen have shot dead 2 judges, both of them women, as a wave of assassinations continues. From Kabul, the BBC's Yogita Limayi reports.
The judges were shot at while they were on their way to work in a car. The driver has been injured. It's not known yet who was behind the attack, but it's the latest in a series of targeted killings over the past few months of journalists, activists and women in high-profile jobs. The attacks have gone largely unclaimed, but the Afghan government has blamed the Taliban for many of them. The two sides are currently holding peace talks in Doha. But with violence surging in Afghanistan, there are serious questions over if and when an agreement can be reached.
Pakistan's drug regulators have approved the use of the Oxford-AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine amid uncertainty about how the country can get hold of the doses it needs. Pakistan's neighbour India launched its own mass immunisation programme on Saturday. Our South Asia regional editor Jill McGivering has this report.
Officials in Pakistan say they hope to make the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine available soon, but it's unclear what route it will use. Its relations with India, a major manufacturer of the vaccine, are strained. It's expected to turn instead to the Global Vaccine Alliance, which is likely to offer free doses for 20% of the population. Pakistan may look elsewhere to fill the gap. It's currently assessing a vaccine developed by the Chinese company Sinopharm. That's expected to gain approval in a matter of days, and acquiring doses directly from its ally, China, should be a simpler political process.
World News from the BBC. The Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is due back in Moscow today for the first time since he was poisoned last year. Doctors treating him in Germany have said he was poisoned with a Novichok nerve agent. Reporting from Moscow, here's Steve Rosenberg.
Alexei Navalny's decision to return home is a direct challenge to Vladimir Putin. The man, Mr. Navalny believes, ordered the attempt on his life. The Kremlin denies that accusation. But in Russia, no criminal case has been opened into the poisoning of Mr. Navalny last summer. Instead, he's the one being investigated. He faces new fraud charges. He was recently put on a wanted list. The prison service here says it intends to detain him for violating the terms of a previous suspended sentence.
Guatemala says it sent almost 1,000 migrants back to Honduras as the authorities try to stop them reaching the Mexican border. Fleeing poverty at home, up to 9,000 began their long walk to the United States this week. But after crossing into Guatemala, they came across lines of soldiers trying to keep them back. Security forces say they've set up several checkpoints along the route to Mexico. The British government is planning new legislation to protect historical monuments. It would prevent the removal of statues, memorials or plaques in England without planning permission. A government minister would have the power of veto. The move follows the toppling of the statue of a slave trader, Edward Colston, in the city of Bristol last year during a Black Lives Matter protest. The US yacht competing in the preliminary round of the America's Cup in New Zealand has suffered a dramatic capsize. The boat, called American Magic, reared into the air as it raced into a high-speed turn. The crew, who ended up in the water, are said to be safe. The Coast Guard and other competitors helped to rescue them. It's unclear if the boat will be able to take any further part in the competition. Live from London, that's the latest BBC News.
You're listening to From Our Own Correspondent here on the BBC World Service. I'm Pascal Harter. Hello and welcome to the programme. In this edition, a plane crash brings to the fore the ever-present dangers of plane travel in Indonesia. Also, as Ireland speaks out at last on the cruelties in its mother and baby homes, we hear how silence and shame covered up so many abuses for so long. And life in Somalia these days. One correspondent reflects on the joys and the surprises, as well as the sorrows. We start in Australia, where it's midsummer and temperatures are climbing. Citizens in some parts of the country have been told to prepare for cyclones and flooding. Last year, the nation was battling bushfires, some of the fiercest ever recorded. As for coronavirus, the Premier of New South Wales says the variants from the UK and South Africa are now threatening Australia too. Already home to a large number of the deadliest creatures in the world, and no stranger to droughts, fires and floods, Australia is not a country where the force of nature can ever be taken for granted. From Sydney, Phil Mercer.
A willful, lavish land is how the poet Dorothea McKellar remembered Australia when she was a homesick teenager in Britain in the early 1900s. Her famous work, My Country, explored its beauty and its terror. It has both in abundance. A year ago, Australia was tormented by the Black Summer fires that went on to burn through 24 million hectares of land. At least 33 people died in the most intense bushfire season on record. Again and again I stood near the ruins of family homes as squadrons of water-bombing aircraft flew overhead. Each day took us to the edge of another emergency and the panic and loss it inflicted. It was unrelenting. So was the smoke. For days on end it smothered cities including Sydney, Canberra and Adelaide. I've never smoked a cigarette, but I felt the sort of congested weight in my chest that a packet-a-day habit might leave behind. This festive season the air was heavy again, but with the humidity of a very different summer. It's cooler and wetter. Already floods have swept into low-lying areas, disconnecting communities. Before Christmas, cyclone-like conditions hit parts of the eastern seaboard. The coast was battered by torrential rain and abnormally high tides. The famous beach at Byron Bay, an 8-hour drive north of Sydney, and a much-loved holiday destination all but disappeared. Some places were inundated by 400 millimetres of rain within 24 hours. Dorothea McKellar could well have described the steady rhythm of rain falling on our metal roof as the drumming of an army. We're getting used to it. It's the hand of a La Niña weather pattern that typically brings more rainfall and tropical cyclones to Australia. This is a land well versed in nature's extremes. From Darwin in the tropics to the ski fields of Thredbo and Mount Hotham in the southeast, there's nothing uniform about the weather nor the broader climate. Heat waves are by far its deadliest natural hazard. Before Christmas, South Australia baked in temperatures of 47 degrees Celsius. But in New South Wales, the most populous state, a long and withering drought is now over. A Royal Commission report into the Black Summer bushfires warned Australians to prepare for an alarming future of simultaneous and worsening natural disasters. It also reiterated that climate change had exacerbated the extreme conditions that had ignited the bushfires. But the debate about global warming has become so politicised here that conservationists fear Australia is being left behind and that its targets to cut emissions are too low. While per capita levels of greenhouse gases are among the highest in the world, the current centre-right government insists Australia will meet its climate goals. We're all a bit battle-weary, and this year, the smoke that kept Australians inside last summer has been replaced by another type of house arrest. The coronavirus continues to menace Australia. Infection rates here are low by many international standards, but a cluster of cases sent parts of Sydney into lockdown over the festive period. Australians have grown up with plenty of official advice about how to avoid the dangers of bushfires and storms. Encouraging public compliance during the pandemic has been a key part in Australia's COVID-19 strategy. Sophisticated contact tracing and the closure of its international borders to foreign travellers last March have also been crucial. So is mass screening. More than 11.5 million coronavirus tests have been carried out. The authorities are organised and cautious, although fines for people not wearing masks have led to accusations that the police have at times been overzealous. As an unreal year finally ended, memories of Australia's Black Summer bushfires remained vivid and painful. In one small town south of Sydney, primary school children have written a book about the fires that destroyed much of their community. There's an illustration of a fiery monster emerging over the side of a hill. It bears down on a defenceless home. This raging creature has an ominous black body, incandescent eyes and mouth. Its fur is ablaze. She summoned her own thunderstorm and scattered her anger across the bush, the book reads. Nothing could stop her. Australia can be an unforgiving and perilous place, but it is rich and undoubtedly resilient. It has to be. There aren't too many countries that can be as wild or unpredictable.
That was Phil Mercer in Sydney. No survivors are expected to be found among the wreckage of the plane that crashed into the Java Sea last weekend, carrying 62 people. The disaster highlights Indonesia's dubious air safety record, one of the worst in Asia. It's had more civilian airliner accidents since 1945 than any other country in the region. There have been many improvements in recent years, but how confident can passengers feel about their journeys? For Rebecca Henschke, who is based in Indonesia for many years, this most recent disaster brought back her own memories of making anxious choices.
The scenes of tangled wires being pulled out of the ocean, barely recognisable bits of plane laid out at the Tanjung Priok port, alongside black bags, clothes and shoes, are all depressingly familiar. Hearing the grief-stricken families praying against the odds that somehow their loved one survived was heartbreaking. Just 2 years ago, I covered the Lion Air crash that killed 182 people. 4 years before that, the Air Asia crash. And in between, regular incidents of planes skidding off runways on takeoff or near-miss landings. Indonesia is made up of thousands of islands, so to get around you have two choices, either long journeys by boat or you fly. The dramatic growth in the country's middle class in the last 2 decades has led to a boom in low-cost carriers, making it possible for more people than ever to fly. Lion Air, Air Asia, Wings, CityLink and Sriwijaya are some of the big ones. But the infrastructure, the runways and airports, and implementation of aviation safety has struggled to keep up. Flying is the quickest and sometimes even the cheapest option, but not always the safest. It's when you speak to the families of those missing after an accident that the true horror hits home. Each seat on the plane has a story. On the flight that went down last weekend was a newly married couple, Ihsan Hakim and Putri Wayudi. They were travelling to Kalimantan to hold a wedding party for Ihsan's extended family. There was a new mother, Indah Putri, going home with her husband and baby after giving birth at her mother's house. While covering the Lion Air crash in 2018, I got to know some of the bereaved. Mutato Kuniawan's newly wedded wife had been on that plane. When we met during those horrible first hours when they were waiting to hear if there were any survivors, he wanted to talk about her. I can't live without her. I love her, he told me through tears. The last thing I said to her was be careful. Later we met up again outside a hospital. He brought her toothbrush in the hope it would help with the identification process. I can't stop thinking about her. Her face fills my mind all the time, he told me then. The last exchange I had with him was during Ramadan, the holy fasting month. He told me he was doing well. He had a deep faith in Allah that was keeping him going, he said. This week I messaged Vinny Wulandari, the sister of the co-pilot of the Lion Air flight, to see how she was doing, seeing it all happen again. Her family, she told me, wasn't just reliving the Lion Air crash, but was in the midst of fresh grief. The husband of one of her cousins was a crew member on the Sriwijaya flight, a father of 5 children. The family is in denial, she says, like I once was. She sent me a photo of a smiling, jolly-looking man in his crew uniform. When a second Boeing 737 MAX, the same model as the Lion airplane, went down in Ethiopia, she'd got in touch with me, asking if I could put her in contact with any families affected by that crash who might want to talk. She wanted to send her prayers and support, but also to talk to them about justice, compensation, and the search for answers. This time it was an older Boeing plane, a classic 737 that crashed, not the newer problematic 737 MAX. The plane was 26 years old, but in good condition, the airline insists. No problems had been recorded on its previous flights. Before the plane took off, according to local media, the new mother, Indah, sent a photo of the plane's wing to her family, saying there was heavy rain and asking for the family's prayers. I've done the same thing myself many times, flying almost every month during the last 4 years I lived in Indonesia. Sriwijaya had one of the better safety records of the low-cost carriers. It was the one I would go with when tossing up which airline to take on island-hopping routes where choices are very limited. I too said a little prayer as we took off, or as we came into land, hoping my flight would be one of the safe ones, one of the ones that came home.
That was Rebecca Henschke. You're listening to From Our Own Correspondent here on the BBC World Service with me, Pascal Harter. In Ireland, the government and Catholic Church have officially apologised for the suffering inflicted over many decades on tens of thousands of unmarried mothers and their children. An official report, which has just been published, revealed, quote, a profound and generational wrong, said the Taoiseach Micheál Martin. There were cases of verbal and physical abuse, of forced separation, of neglect, and even death of very young children. This all happened in mother and baby homes which were supposed to look after the women and find adoptive families for their infants, because the scandal and disgrace of sex outside marriage was considered so great. Chris Page heard the story of a lifetime of secrets from one survivor of the system.
PJ Haverty turned 70 this year, but there's a scene from his youth which he recounts with striking detail and clarity. He was milking cows one evening on the farm where he lived in County Galway. A car drove up a hill towards him. He didn't recognise the number plate because he'd never seen British registration numbers before. 2 ladies were in it. One wound down the window and asked for the family who brought him up. He pointed her towards the house. PJ says, "She kept looking at me and smiling. I thought it very strange. She gave me one last look and smile, and then the car was gone." Eventually, PJ went to London to meet the woman with whom he'd had that fleeting conversation. In 1951, she'd given birth to him in a mother and baby home in the town of Tuam. She told PJ the nuns who ran the institution had told her that her son would be fostered. If she ever found out where he was living, they'd warned, she was to stay away, or else, in PJ's words, she'd be in trouble. She'd done her best to take PJ back. Every week she visited the home to hand in money for her boy's upkeep, but her pleas to see him were rejected. Like many women crushed by stigma, she emigrated. PJ discovered she remained a devoted member of the Catholic Church. The Blessed Virgin, he says, was always his mother's partner, helper and advisor. PJ weighs every word as we walk in a small green enclosed space in the middle of a housing estate where his birthplace once stood. If he'd never met his mother Eileen, he explains, he would have thought she simply left him there. PJ stayed in the home until he was 7. He says his loving foster parents kept him going through the discrimination and bullying. Local people would tell him, "You don't know who you are. You're dirt from the street." Potential girlfriends would be warned by their parents. He could be carrying a disease. PJ is one of tens of thousands of people who suffered ghastly prejudice in a society described by the Irish Prime Minister Micheál Martin as deeply misogynistic and extraordinarily oppressive. The report of the government inquiry points out that Ireland wasn't the only country which had institutions for unmarried mothers, but the proportion of women who went to mother and baby homes was probably the highest in the world. In Ireland, the youngest mothers taken there were girls who were just 12 years old. And the homes operated for longer than in other nations. The last one closed only in 1998. The inquiry has recorded how women were taunted when they were in labour, told the pain was punishment for promiscuity. And the babies? 1 in 7 of the children who were born in those homes died, around 9,000 in all. At the home where PJ was, in Tuam, 978 perished between 1921 and 1961. State authorities knew about the infant mortality rate. Overcrowding and dirty conditions meant infections were rife, but there was no wide concern about youngsters who were branded as illegitimate. People in Ireland are sometimes bewildered as to how such cruelty and callousness was so common just a few decades ago. This is a country which has transformed itself from one of the most conservative and poor in Europe to one of the most liberal and wealthy. Secularisation happened later than elsewhere. Divorce was legalised only in 1995, but the pace of change has been particularly rapid. Nonetheless, history still stings sharply. The legacy of the institutional brutality is multi-generational anguish, which is frequently translated into addictions and early deaths among the system survivors. PJ Haverty now intends to visit his mother's grave to read her the apology which has been issued by the religious order which ran the home in Tuam. He tells how his mother never told her friends in England about her past. Such was her sense of shame. But some of her last thoughts were of PJ. He heard that when she was dying, his mother told a hospital nurse about him. He says his own life turned round when he met his wife, who accepted him for who he was. Reflecting on his love for his 1-year-old grandchild, he laughs and says, "My world turned out beautiful after it all. But," he stresses, "I've been lucky."
Chris Page. Somalia has been in a state of conflict for 3 decades, and that has generated many a stereotype about what life is like there. Words like famine, drought and locusts might spring to mind, or stories of pirates, warlords and Al-Qaeda-linked militants. But there is far more to the country than that. On her most recent trip to the capital, Mogadishu, Mary Harper heard from Somalis who are fed up with being constantly associated with violence and suffering.
Don't you dare go home and write about explosions and pirates, my friend warns me. If you do, I'll post all over social media the photos of you at the beach, drinking coconut milk and playing in the sea. He's only half joking. This is my dilemma when I'm in Somalia. I get pressure from all sides. Some want me to report on how awful the security situation is. Others to concentrate on how peaceful it is. Some urge me to focus on the Islamist militants Al-Shabaab, who for years have controlled large parts of the country. Others try to persuade me not to mention them at all. I could certainly talk about the negative things like the suicide bombings, the great thud of a blast that shakes the air as I eat lunch of camel meat with an old friend, how everybody rushes to get on the phone to find out about what has happened and where, about the bomber who wandered into a restaurant, blowing up himself and 4 others, injuring many more. It had been raining heavily before that attack. My friend tells me how Al-Shabaab takes advantage of thunderstorms because that's when the police take shelter instead of carrying out searches, giving the militants a chance to sneak through with their explosives. I could report on the positive, like my glorious day at the beach. We drive there in a bulletproof vehicle, its solid, heavy doors hard to heave open. We're escorted by a pickup truck full of security guards, bouncing up and down with their guns as we race down potholed roads. After driving past a seemingly endless Turkish military base, we arrive and settle down under the palm trees. As a man slices the tops off fresh coconuts with a machete, my friend passes me his mobile phone. He wants to show me some pictures of the gruesome aftermath of another suicide attack. We are dying in paradise, my friend says, as we sip the fresh, sweet coconut water. We drive back through the city as night falls, the hustle and bustle of people going home from work, lights switching on in shops and cafes, red rickshaws running about like ants. We pass freshly painted new apartment and office blocks springing up alongside the rubble of buildings smashed apart by 30 years of violence. There's a construction boom in Mogadishu despite the regular Al-Shabaab attacks. A recent United Nations investigation found that the militants themselves are investing significant sums in Somali real estate. On this visit, people speak less about militant assaults and more about extortion. They say Al-Shabaab has morphed into a mafia-like organisation, extracting money from businesses, government workers and many others. People tell me it's worth paying, as it gives them a degree of protection. That evening, I have supper on a roof terrace, the warm sea air like a balm around me. I feel simultaneously delighted and sad as we watch videos on smartphones of the good old days, when people sang and danced freely, when women wore filmy, multicoloured gowns, not the drab, heavy robes most of them wear today. The next day I visit the finance minister in his giant office. We talk about recent progress with the World Bank, which will open doors to new funding, and the challenges of Somalia regularly topping the list of the world's most corrupt countries. The minister also tells me about the songs he's often moved to write, perhaps a way of dealing with the pain he and his country endure. In the afternoon it's the Information and Tourism Minister. I ask, slightly tongue-in-cheek, if tourism really could take off in Somalia. Oh yes, he replies, we'll start with the Somali diaspora. We could have offshore dining on boats in the Indian Ocean. It would be less risky that way. I meet so many people with so many bright, brave and inspiring ideas. The scientist who's developed a new way of growing bananas, hoping to revive the country's once thriving plantations. The curator of an exhibition displaying intimate and unexpected images taken by female photographers who brave insults and worse as they go about their work. But then I'm brought back down to earth when a friend calls to say his little brother has fallen sick and died. He invites me to attend the funeral virtually via my phone, as it's too dangerous for me to go in person. It's a journalistic cliché, worn out from overuse, to describe any country as a land of contrasts. In Somalia, the contrasts are more acute and more painful than most other places I know.
Mary Harper, now back from Mogadishu. I'm Pascal Harter. That's all for this edition of the programme, but we will be back next weekend with more stories of the lives behind the headlines. So do join us then here on the BBC World Service for more from our own correspondent.
This is the BBC World Service. Now here's something to think about.
When someone has a brilliant idea, it's a light bulb moment. But then they have to prove their theory.
We have conducted experiments in many so-called small-scale societies, from the Peruvian jungle to Pacific Islands.
I'm David Edmonds, and in The Big Idea, I'll be examining new research on human reason and rationality.
And what we found was that the more people elaborated, the more they also changed their views.
When you ask people who have recently married whether their marriage will end up in divorce, they normally say close to zero, even when the divorce rates are close to 50%.
Men tip 23% more than women tip.
I found some of the most fascinating ideas around and the people who thought them up.
The Big Idea at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
Coming up on Outlook Weekend, Opataya Fawai's music career started when he learnt about the voyaging traditions of his Polynesian